Okay, well, fes gyrma hwydynga, tapel eifr son hyn ha mae'r ffegin, tapel eifr son hyn y machad einchych o Michalar. So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for coming on a quite ropoch and pleasant evening with storm Bram, I think, petering out a little bit, but thank you for coming. We really appreciate that. So this evening we are very proud, Acker, to be launching In the Shadow of the Laird, Highland Factors Before and After Patrick Sellar, by Judith Napier, who is beside me here.
Well, first of all, it's been no hardship to be in Stornoway an extra night. I've had a really lovely time. I think this is a great place, so it's been a pleasure to be here. And I'm so delighted that you're all here tonight. Thank you so much for coming out. And I do need to start by thanking Angus and Acker for hosting this event, to pay sincere tribute to the sponsors of this book and to the Acker team for their unfailing good cheer throughout the process of getting us to publication. Thank you, Angus. So, Duke of Sutherland. You see here on the screen the first Duke of Sutherland, and he's defined the East Sutherland skyline since 1837. Now, the reason why I'm starting with this image is my memory of the reaction it drew when I used it in a talk I gave last year. I remember very clearly one man in the audience being upset, disgusted even, that I'd put it on the screen. He just couldn't look at it, he said, and if it was on the front cover of my book, he wouldn't be buying it. And now this book looks at Highland estate factors over the past 2.5 centuries, but I think that man's very real anger says a good deal about how land management is still perceived. You see the Duke of Sutherland, and you see, walking in his shadow, Patrick Sellar. What I'm trying to do here is to suggest that the desperate times of the clearances needn't necessarily define an entire profession. So why factors, first of all? Well, I got interested in the subject years ago when I was visiting Lochainver, and friends were reminiscing about the poet Norman MacCaig, who was a regular summer visitor to the place. They recalled how MacCaig had mentioned that there seemed to be no books written on the subject. There were plenty about lairds, about crofters, tenants, but none about those men who managed both the land and the people on it. Now, most annoyingly, I found that MacCaig himself didn't mention factors anywhere in his poetry, not even once. Still, he must have been aware of the stultifying influence of the Assynt crofter's owner, and he must have met in the local estate office factors whose treatment of the local population created such a bitter disconnect that it surely contributed to that parish being now in 60% community ownership. So MacCaig's idea seemed an interesting one. And who were these men? And they were always men until recently. These men whose job over the centuries obliged them to collect rent in pennies or in oatmeal or perhaps a single chicken, to know the cost of fencing wire, and yet were also expected to order ounces of nutmeg or gold-rimmed coffee cups for the Laird's lady, who had to organise Christmas parties and school treats, and who even, as in the case of the poor factor on St Kilda, had to barter petticoats with loudly assertive island women. And these men who were often cursed, sometimes murdered, and whose very graves were said to lie bare for grass would not grow over them. Men who were blamed, even as their absentee proprietors were excused. It was literally a thankless job. Now, for centuries, their character, even their appearance, has been dissected. Mothers used their names as a threat to make their children behave. They turn up in satires bearing the face of a wolf or a fox, or, as in a certain pub in Glasgow, their images are used to decorate toilets. And Patrick Sellar, I think, remains the only factor anyone has really heard of. So my research suggested a more varied picture, and I like best this description of the profession. Factors were, said one commentator, men who spent their days walking in the shadow of the laird. Now, this seems as accurate a picture of the role as can be found, while also suggesting a path that might have been dark or uneasy. Of course, it serves as the title of this book. So I'm starting with two contrasting descriptions, one from the 18th century and the next 150 years later. First, from Memorabilia Domestica by Donald Sage, the minister who delivered the last sermon in Strathnaver before it was cleared in 1814. This story is unrelated to those dreadful times. It goes further back to Sage's grandfather, Aeneas. Aeneas was a church minister in Lochbroom, and it seems a man of considerable character and uncommon strength. On one occasion, the local factor, Colin Mackenzie, failed to pay him his stipend. So Aeneas tracked Mackenzie down to a nearby inn. There doesn't seem to have been much in the way of useful dialogue. Instead, Aeneas simply picked up Mackenzie, carried him over to the fireplace, and shoved him up the chimney. This seems to have worked beautifully. He got his money, although it was handed over by Mackenzie in a small act of revenge, entirely in farthings. The next description, several of them in fact all from the 1883 Napier Commission into crofting conditions in the Highlands. Here, again and again, we read of terror, intimidation and brutality, of one factor whose threat to make the people eat one another before he was done with them was still a terrible memory, of crofters so oppressed that, as one said, the only way we can live here at all is by becoming absolutely passive and suffering ourselves to be used and misused at the factor's pleasure. So how did things shift then from matter-of-factly ramming a factor up a chimney to a cowed populace which feared the factor, as one crofter put it, more than Almighty God himself? So at this point, I want to say thank you to Donald MacLeod Strathnaver, who I contacted at an early stage, asking him what he thought of this as a potential project. Donald came back with the name of someone he thought I should explore, and you'd assume, of course, that a person living in Strathnaver would immediately point me to Patrick Sellar. Instead, he told me about Kenneth Sutherland of Caledale, and this became an unexpected starting point for the book. Suggestions from people like Donald were invaluable, and tonight I'd like to focus on some of the sources, published and previously unpublished, that turned up. Kenneth Sutherland was a factor to the 4th Lord Reay of Balnakeil House, and he was part of an astonishing group of local men who between them influenced every aspect of the lives of the district. There was Sutherland, a rent collector of course, but liked and trusted by the tenantry. He was a fine fiddle player, and he taught music to local people. There was the minister, Murdoch MacDonald, announcing political news from the pulpit and holding meetings in the manse about arts and literature. There was Lord Reay himself, who seems to have been a kindly soul. And finally, there was Gaelic bard Rob Donn, recording the daily life of this small Highland community in his poetry and songs. The land, intellectual curiosity and humanity connected them all. Rob Donn composed plenty of spiky, sly satires. No subject and no person, so far as he was concerned, was off limits. But when it came to the death of Kenneth Sutherland, Rob Donn wrote an elegy full of sorrow, making clear the terrible loss to the district. Sutherland, he said, was a man without flaw. He was so beloved that even the fields mourned him. Not just his family, not only the tenantry, but the fields, the very land itself, was grief-stricken. We have another picture of Balnakeil graveyard, where Kenneth Sutherland and Rob Donn are both buried. That's Rob Donn's memorial there in the centre. Rob Donn later wrote an elegy on the death of the 19th Earl of Sutherland. In it, he looked forward without any apparent unease to things continuing unchanged under the new chief. This was the baby Elizabeth, later the Countess of Sutherland. And this is what he wrote. May I see and hear of your marriage to a worthy man who will continue the customs of your forebears. And we'll hear how that turned out later. While Kenneth Sutherland was part of a loyal, close-knit community, another Highland factor around the same time, Baillie John Stewart, was working in Inverness. He was employed by the Earl of Murray, who lived at Donnybristle on the Firth of Forth, and who wanted a manager for his petty estate. We know about the difficulties of factoring this estate because in 1715, Baillie Stewart started a notebook which he continued faithfully for 38 years. It records dozens of letters to the Earl of Murray, and it's a remarkable document. Stewart already had experience of factoring, but this was different. His problem was that, like Kenneth Sutherland, he was concerned to do his best for his tenants, but unlike Sutherland, he had a proprietor whose focus was only on the rental income. Stewart's letters contained nothing but bad news. He often sounded sorry for himself, but heart-sore for the tenantry too. he allowed rents to go unpaid year after year and refused orders to evict a particularly wretched family, saying he couldn't turn them out in the middle of a snowstorm. By 1734, Stuart had abandoned the job and he fell into debt. Eventually, even his wig maker refused him more credit and he died in poverty. William Mackay, the man who first found and edited those letters, judged Baillie Stuart too trusting a soul. No one could accuse the factors who came later of being too trusting. And now, in the aftermath of 1745, changes in land ownership and the drive for improvement moved at pace. The Westminster Board of Annexed Estates imposed factors on 13 estates. One of these was Appin. And here we find another well-known factor, Colin Campbell, the Red Fox. His murder in 1752 has been the subject of a lot of writing, notably Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, Kidnapped. James Stewart of the Glen was arrested, tried and convicted and hanged. His corpse was left on the gibbet, the bones wired together for years. It was a warning of what you could expect if you killed a factor. And this more or less set the tone for what was to come. The reciprocal relationship between laird and clan could no longer be taken for granted. Highland lairds were in thrall to the Age of Enlightenment and increasingly absent, busy undertaking the European Grand Tour, observing the designed landscapes of great English estates, and joining fashionable new societies. They were so anxious to fit in that they would pay good money to shake off their accents. 1 guinea would buy an hour-long class to help you get rid of your Scottishness. And this is a poster relating to the search for enlightenment from Aberdeen University. In the 18th century, the Highlands was considered so remote that visitors were urged to update their wills before setting out. But plenty of travellers did head north. One was an English bishop, Richard Pocock. He noted forestry plantations at Dunrobin, acres of flax at Cider Hall, that's near Dornoch, a walled garden at Skibo, and more tree plantings in Easter Ross. Further south still, he stayed with the Duke of Atholl and admired his ornamental ponds, which had little artificial islands on them. And these little islands had specially built decorative thatched cottages for the swans. And in relation to this, it's notable how thatched cottages, occupied by tenants rather than swans, were considered much less decorative later, when they got in the way of other sorts of grand designs. Landowners urgently needed to finance their lifestyle and were soon hiring new land agents who could implement changes fast. These new factors were often referred to as strangers from the south and unwelcome. And to achieve the changes that employers wanted, they gained a reputation for hard-headed commerce, tending towards brutality. Without trying too hard, I found factors in every corner of the Highlands in the second half of the 18th century, all with that sort of reputation. My favourite is John Macpherson, the black officer of Badenoch, who was thought to be in league with the devil, and his reputation partly rested on his satanic ability to grow crops. What he was actually doing was applying fertilizer to his fields of neeps with what sounds like terrifying results. It didn't have to be this way. There was plenty of advice being published, all aimed at absentee landlords on how to ensure their land and their tenantry might thrive. One writer, James Robertson, gave what seems a complete picture of how vital a factor was to the success of an estate. He said a factor must be a practical farmer, have a solid grounding in the law, set a good example by living on the estate, and have absolute integrity. I found many similar articles, but noticed that as the century drew to a close, these started to sound less like advice and more like warnings of the danger of driving through change for the sake of a quick profit. It's this sort of brash, bullying behaviour that was noted by 19th century historian David Stewart of Garth. The new breed of factors, he said, were oppressive, ignorant of the people, and too inclined to ignore the human cost of too rapid change. His view of what had gone wrong was, on large scale, exactly what his friend Elizabeth Grant of Rothiemurchus observed in a tiny incident played out in the chilly courtyard of her home. There was her brother, stamping about and fretting furiously at 5 a.m. and there were his baffled farm workers straggling in late, wondering what on earth the rush was. He overturned the old system a little too quickly, wrote Elizabeth. It's easy to overlook the fact that, though they're few and far between, women were commenting on these matters. These women weren't factors, but rather from landowning families, and were well placed to observe what was happening, as Elizabeth did, literally on her doorstep. And I found another noteworthy woman in Eliza Fraser, the only Lady Laird in Castle Fraser's 500-year history. She inherited the place aged 58 in 1792 and transformed it. Now, Castle Fraser is in Aberdeenshire, of course, but Eliza had close family links with the Lovett Frasers, the Mackenzies of Seaforth, and was a neighbour of the Gordons of Cluny, who owned Hebridean estates. She was, in the word of one farming expert of the time, a genius. Certainly she appears not to have bothered employing a factor for her 4,500-acre estate. Instead, she took on the job herself and ploughed £500,000 in today's values into her project. The farming expert was astonished. A competent woman, apparently tackling this male preserve. She was, he wrote, exceptional, a miracle for farming. He urged her to surrender her independence to no man, and she never did. There were still factors of the old breed, but they were becoming the butt of jokes. Men like 76-year-old Captain John Grant of Congash, factor for the Grants of Strathspey. He was revered for leading the last clan raid in the Highlands, an enterprise which cost £7,000 in bar bills on the way home, but his outdated farming techniques were noticed and mocked by the newcomers. So we're coming closer to Patrick Sellar. His name was mentioned repeatedly in the Napier evidence. Over and again, the impact of a factor's absolute power in the absence of his employer was highlighted. You might think the landowners who had, after all, installed the factors in the first place would get at least some of the blame, but no. Crofters like this one from Barra told the Commission, "We do not blame the proprietor for what we've endured and still endure, we blame the factors." Or this one in Lewis, "Not Sir James Matheson to blame, but the former factor." Or in Betty Hill, "I was blaming the factor for the whole, the Duke is a good man." In fact, the best examples of blind devotion against all reason out of all of the 5 volumes of Napier evidence relate to the tenantry of Sutherland estates, the lands which witnessed so many of the worst atrocities. Rob Dawn had hoped the customs of the last several centuries would continue. Elizabeth, however, along with her husband, the first Duke of Sutherland, decided to introduce new customs, which leads to Patrick Sellar. I spoke to one of Sellar's direct descendants, and she said this was the family's favourite image of him. So here he is. Sellar was born in 1780 in Elgin. He was a successful land agent there, and it's often said that if he'd remained in Murray, he would have been judged a complete success. But his ambition took him north, and the tragedy unfolded. In 1816, he was tried for crimes relating to the Strathnaver clearances. He was acquitted, but the verdict resolved nothing. He and his guilt lived on in satires, in accounts of his death, which was said to have been the worst imaginable, eaten alive by maggots, and of course in novels, histories, and in particular in the remarkable drama by John McGrath and his 784 Theatre Company. When I was growing up in Easter Ross in the 1970s, the subject of the clearances was entirely ignored. We lived less than an hour's drive from Croik Church and walked to school past the Tain toll booth where wounded crofters were held after the Battle of Greenyards. But the 1973 tour of the Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil was, for most of us, the first we'd ever heard of it. Actor John Bett played Patrick Sellar, but that was only one of his roles. He played a Whitehall bureaucrat and joined in Gaelic songs too, with multiple costume changes. Surely no one would be so mesmerised by his tall black hat that they would actually believe that Sellar was in the room. But extraordinarily, yes, it happened here during a performance in the Western Isles. An elderly woman lunged forward and attacked John Bett. John told me later that she shouted at him, "Burn in hell, you son of the devil." The link between Sellar and every other factor simply will not go away. It was there again at the first meeting of the newly established Assynt Crofters Trust. They needed someone for the day-to-day running of the place, a factor, in other words. They chose a local man, Patrick MacPhail. But what should his job title be? The ghost of Sellar was hovering. MacPhail's widow told me, when Pat was asked to be the factor, his response was that yes, he would do the job, but with the name Patrick in Sutherland, the term factor was a bad idea. So crofting administrator he became. By the time of the Napier Commission, there was a new Sutherland factor. He was Evander MacIver, who ruled in Scourie for 50 years, working for the Dukes of Sutherland and Westminster. MacIver was born in Gress and was a near contemporary of John Munro Mackenzie, factor for Sir James Matheson. MacIver wrote a fairly pooterish sort of a memoir, full of his own importance, while all we have for Mackenzie is his work diary for 1 year. But both are pretty illuminating. Do we have the next one by any chance? Oh, we do. Excellent. So the pair probably knew each other. Mackenzie mentions several MacIvers undoubtedly related to Evander, and possibly Evander himself. At any rate, a Mr. E. MacIver arrived by steamer on the 21st of March, 1851, to discuss Gress, which had been the home of his late father. Now, Mackenzie's diary shows Mackenzie's dedication to his job. Entries run from Monday to Friday, sometimes over Saturday. Sometimes Saturdays extend to 1 a.m. the following morning, but there's only one entry for a Sunday. The crisis for which Mackenzie exceptionally broke the Sabbath related to the Mathesons' pet deer, Bella. Bella had been killed, and her head and guts were found in a drain. Mackenzie wrote, "This is one of the greatest outrages I've heard of being committed here, and it's to be hoped the perpetrator will be discovered." Now, clearly Mackenzie knew how high this would rank in the scale of crimes for Matheson. To a modern reader, the contrast between those dank, clay-floored cottages described by Mackenzie and the glittering, gas-lit castle feels powerful enough, but nothing illustrates the disconnect between the newly ennobled proprietor and his tenantry more than the resources brought to bear on a Sabbath day to find and then punish the killer of an indulged animal named Bella. It feels as though there should be a world of difference between MacIver, Mackenzie, and a teenager, Peter Sutherland, who studied at Glasgow Technical College at the beginning of the 20th century. But just 3 years separates MacIver's death and Peter's student days. Peter was among the first generation to aspire to the job of factoring without going to an ancient university. I was lucky to be lent his notebook by a former apprentice, now a retired factor. Peter was just a little step behind an unnamed factor on Loch Ness side, and I found his notebook in the National Library of Scotland. The Upper Foyers estate was owned by Glasgow man John Cunningham, who arranged for Inverness solicitors Innes and MacCaig to manage the place. This firm was so successful at factoring that it was said you could walk from the east coast to the west on land solely factored by them. Here, anyway, we're dealing with someone who tramped the marches, scrawling memos on a notebook that's spattered with rain, smeared with dirt. I think we might have a look at some of it so you get a sense of his daily job. I mentioned earlier that being a factor was a thankless task, and this notebook shows just how thankless it really was. So the first entry, in March 1900, looks at problems in a shepherd's cottage. Quote, "Kitchen vent works badly, rain getting in." As the years pass, the notebook reveals the many ways in which this shepherd's home continued to disintegrate. The floor rotted, the closet mouldered, the pointing crumbled, drains would drip, the skylight would leak, slates would blow off, snow would blow in. The roof fell in, and the bedroom was in such a hopeless state that the shepherd and his wife were forced to sleep in the kitchen and put their children in a cupboard. So, given this list over 13 years and the poor factor's detailed plans for repairing each successive problem, one might have hoped for transformational results. Well, no. Here's the last entry. quote, "In connection with the shepherd's house, I will look in on Monday next and see whether the work has been properly done about the smoky chimney." So nothing much had changed, except in a matter of months everything did. The shepherds and all the estate workmen would leave their glen and travel to the battlefields of France instead. After 1918, estates were broken up, sold and resold. We started in Assynt and we'll finish there. For the past 250 years, this land has been owned by an assortment of wealthy families, but the land use didn't change, and nor did the management style, by a succession of factors. So there should be no great surprise at a 1962 story in the Times, which reads as though it had come straight out of the Napier Commission. It's related to landowner Ronald Vesty. Vesty was one of the wealthiest men in the UK, and his main ambition for his Highland home was to see the land remain unaltered from the day he arrived there in 1936. By the date of this news report, he'd done quite well in that regard. In the past 28 years, only one private house had been built. None of the thousands of empty acres had been released for council housing. But there were hopes that the district council might push through some new developments to create some new jobs. The Times reporter visited Lochainver to follow this up and met more or less a wall of silence. One unattributed quote said, "I don't think the proprietor's to blame anyway." We heard this exact line a century earlier at the Napier Commission. This, then, was how things were managed in Assynt, until rapidly and sometimes chaotically they weren't. The dynamic shifted with two land buyouts. First, the groundbreaking Assynt Crofters purchase in 1993. Then, following the Scottish Land Reform Act, the Assynt Foundation's acquisition of Glencanisp and Drumrooney in 2005. What comes next makes an interesting study of what happens when a community decides there's a better way of doing things, and with the legacy of the Vesties, who could blame them? The Assynt Foundation was elated at their success, but not everyone was convinced, not least Alan McRae, chairman of the Assynt Crofters Trust. He told me dubiously, "Buying is one thing, who's going to be running it?" Well, just about everyone had a shot, as it turned out. The foundation board, drawn from volunteers among the local population, found the process of management almost crippling. There were sniggers about 2.9 million being a high price to pay for a few vegetables from the walled garden, and raised eyebrows when visitors to the estate office found it manned only by a dog lying sound asleep on the desk. The foundation appointed its own factor, Gordon Robertson, a professional land agent with decades of experience under his belt. After he parted ways with them, he gave a frank account of his experience in a local news sheet. I'm very sorry, I completely forgot about Assynt. You could have been looking at Assynt all this time. So Gordon Robertson wrote about his experiences, and his account listed a series of failings which he laid at the director's door, including squandered and uncompleted projects and the selling off of major assets. As recently as a few years ago, the foundation was still generating headlines relating to financial chaos. Now they've linked up with the Woodland Trust in a collaboration agreement, and they're clear about one thing: there'll be no more factors there. Robertson sadly died in 2023. He was a self-deprecating, entertaining and a very generous interviewee. He made clear to me that an estate of whatever kind needs professional management, not just a board of amateurs, no matter how well-intentioned. I spoke to land agents and landowners about what they considered the best model for a factor in the 21st century. They all stressed that the best were these with local knowledge, practical ability and integrity, just like Kenneth Sutherland of Caledale, in fact. That man who was so beloved that when he died, even the fields mourned him. There are more of this sort, I think, than has generally been assumed. And it's past time they emerged from the shadows. Thank you very much.
I should thank a number of people for all their various contributions. Thank you, of course, to Judith, first of all, for her hard work, her patience, her coming to Acker in the first place, and for her good cheer in the process of getting to this stage. Thank you to Franny for travelling here with Judith and being in charge of the presentation, for the Acker staff, without whom there would be no such books. So thank you to all of you for another year of hard work and another year of publishing. And thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to the library staff, because it's always such a lovely venue, a lovely comfortable venue for this kind of thing. And I should thank formally a number of bodies who've provided funding for the book. So before I forget any of them, the Stornoway Trust, and we're very pleased that Ian MacIver is here this evening, the Assynt Crofters Trust, Anderson MacArthur, Mooyaville Community Wind Farm Trust, the Gaelic Society of Inverness, the Lewis Island Crofters Limited, Dalmore Estate, Innes and Mackay Limited, Grimmerstadt Estate, and Scottish Land and Estates. So thank you to all of them.